I don't know if you know this, but I used to be a minister.
I did not know that.
Yeah, years and years ago, different lifetime. I grew up in a fundamental Christian church. I have 2 degrees in religion, and I was a minister for 8 years. And when I was preaching, I don't know if this is accurate, but I heard that basically about the ideal window for people's ability to sit and absorb is 22 minutes.
I believe that.
Now, maybe a podcast is a little bit longer. They can be driving, on a bus, mowing the lawn. But when they have to just sit there and pay attention with no distractions, I'd shoot for around 22 minutes, except for the church that I was in kind of had this old school mentality that the longer you preached, the more work you had done and the more they were getting their money's worth.
The more saved they got.
something like, hey, we're paying the preacher good money. He better, put the work in to bring us, a long enough sermon that we feel like we've, that we paid, that we can justify what we paid him. It was more along those lines.
I didn't know that about you. How did you get into the ministry? What got you in?
What got me in? Lack of something better to do, probably. I grew up in this, fundamental Christian Church of Christ.
Mm-hmm.
Not the same Church of Christ of Latter-day Saints around you.
Right.
Pretty fundamental, pretty strong in the southern U.S. I grew up in the Seattle area, so back then Washington was considered a very unchurched area until the people around you, moved in there and churched it. So
churched it up.
there are a lot of Mormons in the Washington area.
Yeah.
Kind of by the time I got to high school, and thought about dropping out about my junior year because I'd lost interest. And people, what are you going to do? What are you going to do? I had no clue. All I know is I'd taken debate my junior year and did well in that and continued that my senior year and did well. And I'd always, I liked church. I liked going to church camp. I liked studying, biblical history, and those things were interesting to me. So I thought, well, maybe I could go. And my intention was to, go and maybe develop some kind of ministry, especially working with, young adults and families and then I took psychology my freshman year in college and thought, I like this. So then it's from there, okay, how can I apply kind of more of the counseling mentality into the ministry work? So I actually got my PhD in marriage and family therapy while I was still, doing ministry stuff. So in a way, it kind of paid my way through grad school.
Interesting. So would you still consider yourself a man of the cloth in any way? Like what's your state? What's the state of your faith these days?
That's hard. I don't know a good word for it. I'm not religious. I tend to see religion as man-made apparatus that probably serves some viable purpose, but it usually is more about control and self-preservation of the actual religious body itself.
Yeah.
That's my spin. I don't like the word atheist. That has a lot of connotations and it also implies that we're starting with theism as the starting point and then going against it.
Right.
And I like, what's the comedian's name? Comedian does the HBO shows and kind of irreverent and liberal. I can't think of his name.
So far, that's all of them.
Yeah. I'll think of it later.
Okay.
He says, I'm an I don't knower. And I think that's as close as I get. I don't know. I'm really open to the idea that there's something truly amazing, infinite. There's a consciousness that's, kind of the way I tend to put it. And I don't know your religious leanings, but I tell people the reason that I believe that Jesus got nailed to a cross is that basically he said, we're both the creator and the created. I am God and so are you. Now, people hear that from an ego point of view, or you're saying this person ego-wise is God. And I don't think that's what Jesus was teaching. Yet, I think a very Eastern message that basically said there is no duality, and religion creates that duality. God's out over here, we're over here. We've emanated this many spaces from God. I tend to think that maybe everything is some kind of unified whole. But I also say, if somebody comes to me and says, I know God and I know God's will, I tend to say, I don't want that God. If that God can be grasped by your mind, that's not a big enough God.
Right?
I want a God that we can't pigeonhole very easily.
For sure. Certainly. So, I mean, we had this other topic, and we'll get to it in a second, but I'm really curious about your journey, like from being in the ministry to where you are now. Was there a moment of epiphany where you realized, oh, this is, you saw the Matrix? Like, what was your transition out of that like?
Yeah. I see we're recording. I'm okay with that. Any way you want to use this, that's fine with me. People ask me that a lot, and especially people that are kind of struggling with their own transition around religion. And especially, if they inherited a faith from their family, and now they're questioning that and moving away, and their family, is resisting.
Right.
And mine wasn't really so much like that. Honestly, I kind of fucked things up is what started the process.
Saucy.
Yeah, it is. I had an affair with a member of my congregation when I was preaching. Now, she also happened to be my wife's best friend. So that made a big mess. So it's kind of like, that's like over 30 years ago. And and unfortunately it got me moving in a good direction. And, one of the things that actually probably my first my own, insight of self-awareness I ever had was during that time. And, I was up preaching in front of my congregation of 300 or so people. And, there was my wife sitting next to the woman I was having an affair with, and, with the kids nearby and all this.
Oh, wow.
And I've been asking myself, how did I get here? How did I get to this place?
Right.
I mean, it wasn't like I could justify it. It was an okay thing to be doing. I knew it wasn't. And it hit me that, I was so far out of integrity in so many other areas of my life. This was just one more step in that direction. Even like, to give an example, when my first preaching job, I got fired. And I got fired because I was a youth minister at the time. And I was teaching a class to the teenage kids, the high school kids, on how to make conscious values decisions. Because I was in the southern U.S. and Arkansas, and it was a dry county, and religion is real strong there, and drinking was considered a sin by many people in the church. But these kids would go off to college, up to Missouri or University of Arkansas, and they would just go nuts. Just drinking and going crazy. And so I was trying to help these kids establish their own internalized value system based on principles that they could get from the Bible. Instead of just following the parental rules, thou shalt not drink. Well, some of the parents didn't like that I wasn't just teaching them, thou shalt not drink. And they stirred up enough that I got fired. I got quickly hired by another church just up the street, same denomination, but smaller church. And, I thought, okay, I'm not going to rock the boat anymore. That tied into my nice guy issues that don't upset anybody, don't rock the boat. So I was already a nice guy, avoiding conflict, seeking approval. And that just kind of magnified it, especially professionally. So, I wouldn't preach anything or say anything if I thought might rock the boat, get too much of a reaction. And I basically was just playing it safe in most areas. That was happening in my marriage as well. Wasn't really dealing with any core issues. My then first wife and I were both big conflict avoiders, both of us.
Right.
So really, I just got to the point where I just wasn't really in integrity with much of anything in my life. So that blew things up. And so I look back on it. Nobody ever taught me that you could end stuff. You could quit, you could leave. So he got me out of my marriage and got me out of being a preacher and out of that church, which looking back, those are both things that needed to have happened, but I didn't know how to do that. So I kind of blew things up unconsciously. From there, I didn't just reject religion. I actually went shopping for some kind of religious, body to be a part of. I then started working on, I already had my doctorate in marriage and family therapy. So started working on building a counseling practice, but I still wanted to be part of a church. And I did marry the woman that I had the affair with. That's who I was married to when I wrote No More Mr. Nice Guy.
Okay.
And I started looking, I kind of looked at the more traditional, Episcopal, Methodist, traditional type churches, and they were just so kind of sterile and rigid in their, way of doing things. And I looked at kind of some more of the, maybe the more of the Pentecostal or the mega church stuff. And, I just wasn't inspired by everybody waving their hands in the air, singing praise Jesus over and over again.
Sure.
It's kind of like, let's just turn off our mind and just, go all into emotion around this. And then, I tried kind of more what I guess you'd call the New Thought, or the Unitarian and other types. And it seems like I kind of heard the same sermon there every time I went there. So I just, looked and nothing. The only thing that actually struck me as being close to what might be considered a New Testament church was 12-step programs. And so I got more involved in just doing 12-step work. And just over time, just began to question most of the fundamental underpinnings of especially Christian belief systems that I just accepted without, how much of the New Testament can you actually trust as being, a legitimate historical document?
Sure.
How much of what was written about Jesus can you actually trust? And just more and more, I just began to, just trust what I could actually experience or know. And like I was saying, pretty much that's evolved into, all right, I can trust that there is something bigger and more amazing than what I can conceive of. What that is, I don't know, but it's pretty amazing. And but I don't think I need to worship it or obey it. I think I just need to be in awe of it and get up and have some gratitude about it every day.
Yeah. I think there's an interesting line between the idea that we need to be worshipful of it and the idea of being in alignment with it, which I think is what Jesus was talking about. Like, first of all, I'll just say to those who are listening, when I talk about Jesus, I talk about Jesus like I talk about Yoda and Luke Skywalker.
Okay.
Like, I'm not really concerned about the historicity of Jesus.
Yeah.
What I am,
he's an archetype.
Yeah. I'm fascinated by the stories, though, and so I just like watching a good movie, just like you guys that get crazy about Game of Thrones. Let's just pretend that dragons are real for a second. Let's talk about Jesus, And so, like he would always talk, like you mentioned, he talked about being one with the Father. And I think that's what he was trying to communicate, was this idea of alignment rather than obedience. Those are two different things.
Yeah. And my personal opinion is probably what went south is that I think he was bringing what we would call maybe a very Eastern thought. And there's theories that he went and, studied Buddhism, Hinduism. And spent time in the East in between being a carpenter intern and starting his ministry at 32. Because if you look at his messages, they're very much Eastern thought in nature. But what happened is he went back to preach Eastern thought to a very rigid religious system that tended to take everything literally. And he spoke metaphorically because you can't speak of God literally. You have to speak of God metaphorically.
Right.
That's all the human brain can do. And unfortunately, his audience took his metaphors and took them real literally, and like they'd done everything else. And that's where I think it kind of got off the rails.
Right. Got himself into some trouble. Maybe it could be said that Jesus didn't know his audience very well. He was probably not that good at stand-up comedy.
Actually, I think he knew his audience perfectly well, and he probably actually knew where this might take him.
Sure.
And even having some inclination of how it might end is still a beautiful metaphor and a beautiful archetype.
Indeed.
The idea of this Christ archetype on the cross, saying, God, forgive them, they don't know what they do. Of both this, kind of masculine and feminine presence all wrapped up in one, the doer and the acceptor. Is, whether he knew where it was leading or didn't, knew his audience or didn't. I think there's a lot of value in it, as you say.
Yeah.
But let's just not take too much of it too literally.
Yeah, for sure. So I think this is actually a good transition into our topic today. In our last conversation, you said something that got my attention, and that was you were talking about rites of passage and about how we were talking about men specifically, but that raises another question we'll get to in a minute. Talking about how people need a mentor to guide them through a rite of passage and the value of rites of passage. And so I wonder, first of all, for the sake of our audience, could you tell us what you understand a rite of passage to be? Like, define that for us.
All right. Well, that's a good question and a good place to start. And I'll just say up front, I don't see myself as an expert on this other than, like most people, you can read some good books out there on it. And Iron John by Robert Bly is probably a good place, looking at Joseph Campbell's, Hero's Journeys,
right.
Good places to go look at.
Yeah.
But the rites of passage, just to kind of put it as simple as possible and maybe even metaphorically, probably goes back to tribal times where we lived in a very harsh world. For, say 1.5 million, 2 million years of early human existence, we were hunters and gatherers. We traveled in tribe and had a very harsh existence. And there was probably a fairly distinct distinction between the roles of men and women. I know we don't really like that nowadays. We like to see.
Oh, how dare you?
Fluid. Yeah, and they are very fluid.
Sure.
But when tribal times, if a young girl at 14 is pregnant, she's pretty vulnerable, can't get out and hunt and gather, and needs to be protected and provided for.
Yeah.
And that's probably what the able-bodied men and probably some of the women went out and did. They hunted and gathered and fought and provided and protected. And in order for men to do that, they had to be trained how to do that well. And the term I use, how to do that masterfully, in order to provide and protect and survive and pass on the genes that we now see floating around today, that we're all part of. So most tribes, even tribes in modern areas that have not been highly affected by invasion of Western culture, still tend to have initiation rites where the men take, this is true of Native Americans as well, where the men take the boys out and put them in kind of a metaphorical situation that simulates the possibility of death, where they've got to face that fear that this could kill me.
Right.
And they train them, prepare them for it, and they support them in that process. And there's all kinds of various rituals that, you go out and, do the research on it. There's all kinds of various rituals that men have put the boys in. And in the tribal times, this was just understood that's how the process worked. And kind of Robert Bly, when he talks about it in Iron John, kind of tells it, kind of tongue in cheek, where, the boys are with the mothers, the women, until about 11 or 12. And then one day the men of the tribe put on the war paint and stage a raid and carry off the 12-year-old boys. The mothers are weeping and crying and screaming and hanging on to them. And then once they're gone, they turn to each other and say, how'd I do? They knew that was part of the process.
Sure.
It was time to let go. And then the men took the boys out and trained them and initiated them so that they would then be initiated into that scary world of the masculine. Now, even up until probably the last 100 to 200 years, a lot of that still took place with boys being apprentices, working on the farms with dad, grandpa, uncles, cousins, brothers, where the boys were trained by men to do the challenging work of men, which is often challenging and life-threatening even. And so they did it as part of a tribe, whether this is a tribe 1.5 million years ago on the savannas or a tribe, on a farm in, Midwest, 120 years ago. Boys were raised by men to do what was considered the work of men, however we define that. Nowadays, my kind of view of that is that men have kind of abdicated that role. Men are not particularly involved in the upbringing of boys. Luckily, I see a big shift in that, where a lot of younger fathers and fathers-to-be, because I'm around a lot of young men, actually talk about how they want to be and are involved with their children, and especially their sons.
Mm-hmm.
And so I see that as a really positive thing. But unfortunately, for a few generations now, most men have grown up in what I call the nursery. That is, raised by moms. Dads weren't around either because of divorce, separation, addiction, work. Dads just weren't there all that much to teach boys all that much. So they're raised by moms, go to a preschool around all women, go to elementary school, mainly have female teachers, get into junior high, start being interested in the girls and have no clue of how to interact with them. Get into college, maybe get into a frat. Maybe they're lucky enough to play sports or go in the military and get some direction there. But one of the things I talk about when I see a lot of young men, especially Generation X, millennial men, is that they've not gotten out of the nursery. Their life's been comfortable. They grew up with the internet. They grew up with parents providing pretty much everything they needed, and the primary influence in their life being feminine. And, they sit around, watch TV, they smoke dope, surf the internet, jack off to porn, seek women's approval. Maybe they go out and get a really great, hipster haircut and grow a hipster beard. But they haven't fucking done anything in their lives, and they have no clue of how to meet challenge or how to lead in a relationship with a female partner. And I'm not trying to be negative or critical.
Mm-hmm.
It's not guys' faults. It's every generation that's gone before that abdicated that role of mentoring young boys into a masculine adulthood.
And so that leaves us to this really weird place today where there's so much dissatisfaction on both sides, it seems.
Well, we're in a stage of transition, which actually I'm really excited about.
Yeah.
I'm excited that, the things that both the feminism of my era in the 60s and 70s when I was young, and even like the Me Too feminism now, is shaking some things up. But it kind of leads me to, what you and I've just chatted a little bit about. I think it's also unconsciously leading men to seek out tribe and to seek out mentors, even if they don't know that is what they're doing. I think that a lot of men, all the way, I'm 63, so, my age down to like my son's age at 33 or down into their 20s, men maybe don't intellectually know they need mentored and need a tribe of men, but emotionally they do, and they go looking for that one way or another.
Right. What are some ways you see men, like what's the dark side of tribe seeking that you see in our culture today? And then I want to talk about the light side of it.
Okay, sure. Let's stay with the archetypal, way of viewing things. The dark side. Okay, if we operate on the premise that I'm putting out, and this is just a premise, that it's in our DNA to be mentored by and initiated by tribe. It's in men's DNA.
Yeah.
And I think you could actually make a pretty good argument to support that.
Sure.
So say that's in our DNA and say it's not happening. We will go seek it in one form or another. I imagine that young men now with the internet tend to seek it through social media, through the video games where you're online with other people playing video games, through online forums, whether it be alt-right, white supremacists, manosphere, men going their own way.
Oh yeah.
Whatever it is, more of the darker side probably feeds a negativity and a bitterness. The incels will add that to it.
Sure.
Involuntarily celibate young men that can't get laid, and they're angry at women for that. But to me, that still goes back to the fucking initiation. Is if we don't get initiated into a healthy masculine, women are not going to be particularly attracted or drawn to us or want to get naked with us.
Right.
So I think the internet and social media can fuel a real negative side to that. I think a number of the mass shootings that we've seen have been fueled by the same thing of men not having tribe or initiation, but yet finding tribe in an angry group that is, lashing out against some other group whom they perceive as being the cause of their suffering. So when uninitiated men tend to dwell in their bitterness and negativity and helplessness, and I think that does get manifested in some pretty dark ways, and some of which that probably we haven't seen yet because they're hidden from the light of day. But I think they'll keep creeping out. We'll keep seeing more and more of that.
One of the things I've been dying to talk to you about is this business of rites of passage. Do you think it is necessary for there to be a mentor involved, or is it possible to self-style a rite of passage? Is it possible for a guy to say, hey, I realize, that I need some additional challenge in my life. I'm gonna pick my own Mount Everest. I'm just gonna go for it. Like, is mentorship essential or not?
I'll say it helps.
Yeah.
It helps. Here's what I think is essential is some form of direction and accountability. Now, that doesn't necessarily have to come from some authority figure, or even necessarily, from somebody, a lot older than you. For example, I see online men's coaches, 25, 26 years old. And, there's this part of me that says, what the fuck is a 25-year-old guy going to teach other guys?
Sure.
But, I've been around some of these 25-year-old, life coaches, and some of them are really astute, smart young men. I do think there's something to be said by, having enough time to fuck up enough times to get some real wisdom out of that. But I'll give an example. I'm in a men's program myself that is led by a coach who has mentored. His mentor is David Data.
Oh yeah.
And my coach has worked with Data for over 10 years, and he leads the program that I'm in. And when I started working with him, John is his name, John Wineland. When I started working with him as my own personal coach a couple of years ago, he even said to me, Robert, your book's on my reading list for my men's program. What can I give you? And I said, hey, you've got training, you've got specialties that are new to me. I'm still working on my stuff. I still need it. So he's younger than me, 10 years maybe. But he's got a wisdom that is beneficial to me. Now, it's good to like have maybe a little bit of a hierarchical structure where you kind of submit a little bit to somebody's direction and experience and wisdom. And I've had to do that, and it's been a good process. There have been times where I've been resistant and I've been kicking and screaming, and he gave me an assignment a year or so ago that he then brought into the men's program that I met with him. And I just kicked it. I just told him, I'm just going to, kick and scream and resist this and be pissed off about it. And I said, and then I'm going to do it. And I have, and it was beneficial.
What was it?
Well, what he calls it is a feminine reconciliation, where basically as men, you sit down, and there's a few stages to it, but the first stage is looking back on the significant relationships you've had with women in your past, and begin to make just free associate, brainstorm wherever you didn't lead, wherever you did not love them as fully as you could have, where you didn't accept their gifts, where where basically you introduce toxic elements into the relationship. And in my mind, as being the kind of nice guy, giver, covert contract guy, I thought I'd given so much to every woman I've been with. They were the ones that drug their feet. They were the ones that made the relationship difficult. They were the ones, blah, 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 blah. And so I really resisted because I wanted to hang on to this thing. It was their fault. These relationships didn't work. I'd done my best. And when I sat down and started working on it, it was really enlightening. And what came out of it probably was not what I expected, and maybe wasn't even what John expected. It doesn't really matter because it wasn't his expectation. It was mainly just for us to have a better understanding of our leadership role in relationship, and to clear out any past karma, whatever you want to call it, any dangling loose ends between us and the feminine in the world. And what I came away with, and which was really helpful and insightful and beneficial for me, was that in every single relationship I've had as an adult, I failed to lead in such that I did not identify bad or inappropriate behavior by the woman early and draw a line.
Oh, okay.
I failed to lead by saying, wait a minute, whether second date, third date, fifth date. Now, I did do this a few times in a relationship, and looking back, it was really very powerful. But in general, I didn't say, wait a minute, stop. This is unacceptable to me. Whether it's them, not showing up, when they say they're going to, or not, just falling off the radar for a few days without any, let me know, breaking up with me out of the blue with no real reason, once a month or so, being in contact with an ex-boyfriend, having an anger, outburst at me, whatever it might be. I did not say, wait, stop. That isn't going to work. If you want to hang out with me, you're going to have to do it this way.
Why didn't you do that? Like, what was your inner story?
I was never trained to do that.
Oh, okay.
I was trained in my families that, you put up with shit to get love. Boundaries were not taught in my family. I was in my 30s and in my second marriage and already had a PhD in marriage and family therapy before a therapist introduced me to the concept of personal boundaries. I had no clue that you could say to people, no, stop, don't do that. If you do that again, we're done. And I did do that a few times early on. I can think of two different examples where I set a boundary with a woman I'd been dating, in each case about a month or so. And in both cases, it's kind of like it lit them up in a positive way. And they showed up even more because they were really turned on by the boundaries and the way I invited them to behave differently. Right. So looking back through that feminine reconciliation, if I had done that in each relationship when the first red flag popped up, and if I had addressed it right then and said, this is not acceptable, this is how you have to do it if you want to hang out with me, and if it happens again, we're done. And if I'd consistently followed that pattern, I would not have had any of those I would not have carried any kind of residue of resentment or rage or pissed offness at women in my past, because I would have dealt with it in that moment. That was my lack of leadership. So that's where John introduced this. I kind of, pushed against it and then knew that I was going to do it because I could see it probably had benefit. And I did it, and it was transformational, and it's helped me in my current relationship with my wife. That now I don't let those things just go by. It's really clear. Now, we're going to hang out together. You can't do it this way.
Right.
And she likes that. She likes that she knows, what was expected of her and what's clear. So that's an example of where it took me having a mentor that I pushed against that was very, it was very helpful and it produced a good result. Now, another example maybe of a mentorless situation, about 3 or 4 months ago, I was sick about a year and a half ago, almost died, lost a bunch of weight, and then had surgery, and I had a tumor in my small intestine, and I bounced back, but I lost about 30 pounds, but gained about 45, and for about a year didn't exercise very much. And I didn't like, that. I wanted to get back to be consistent with that. So in my men's group, I just put up a notice and I said, anybody want to join me in an exercise accountability group on WhatsApp? And a couple guys did. And we've stayed connected, and every day we check in. What's our exercise intention for that day? And check in if we did it, how we did. And, if we haven't heard from each other in a day or two, we check in. So that doesn't really have a mentor or somebody in charge, but there's 3 adult men. We're all mentoring each other. We're all holding each other accountable. So the main piece, or the 2 pieces I think we men really need, is some sort of direction or instruction and some sort of accountability. Something holding our feet to the fire, whether it's in this peer exercise group on WhatsApp or whether it was a coach that sometimes pisses me off when he holds my feet to the fire and says, Robert, we're gonna sit here until you lean into whatever it is you're resisting.
I can see how the accountability part of that could be facilitated by a variety of people. like the younger coaches you're talking about, these young guys that are, like awesome. Like that just takes organization and discipline on the part of the coach, to keep tabs on you. Now the direction part, is it, I've wondered before if it's possible to be coached to do a thing by somebody who's never done the thing before. Like, does that make sense? Like,
it's a good question, and probably we could probably come up with examples either way.
Yeah, like Tiger Woods has a coach, but has Tiger Woods' coach ever golfed has his coach golfed better than Tiger has?
Has his coach ever won a green jacket at the Masters?
Correct.
No.
Yeah.
No. And so that's a good question, and there are actually a lot of athletic coaches that did not excel at the big league level, however you want to describe it. In fact, I think if you look at most baseball coaches and managers, in fact, even a lot of football coaches and managers, washed out after, in college somewhere or, somewhere in the minors, but they were smart and they understood fundamentals and basics and maybe psychology, and they're good teachers and they're good coaches. So does a baseball coach have to have won a World Series in order to be a successful coach? No, there's a lot that haven't. Do you have, does a golf coach have to win the Masters? Probably not.
Okay.
So I think you could argue that in some maybe technical areas that a person doesn't have to have reached the highest rung, of things to be a good coach. Michael Jordan had coaches who brought out the best in him who had never achieved what he achieved.
Right.
So that can be done. But I do think there is something to be said by somebody who's gone through the fire. I don't know if I'd want to go in the military and have my, the whatever service you're in and having, the lead guy in your platoon, never having gone through boot camp, never having, been in a foreign conflict, or, maybe he just sat at a desk and shuffled papers all the time and now he's going to lead me into war. I don't think so.
So there is a line. So there is a level of proficiency that is reasonable to expect from a coach. But so that I'm starting to see this kind of gray area where there's one boundary here and then there's one up here. And so what do we, for us guys that are listening to this conversation right now, that we realize, because I think most of the men that are listening to this on some level are probably nodding their head saying, yeah, like I have a Mount Everest I want to climb. Mm-hmm. I have a rite of passage. I feel called to a rite of passage, but I don't, it's still kind of vague. What advice could we come up with for these guys in terms of picking out their mentor, picking out their coach?
Well, that's a good question. And I'll make this gray area even murkier. I got my PhD in marriage and family therapy at 29 years old. So that's pretty young.
Yeah.
And most people don't want to go to a 29-year-old marriage therapist. And when after my second divorce, I was in my late 40s and went out and learned how to date and got good enough at it that my clients started asking me to teach them what I was doing. So, I never thought that I'd ever be a dating guru of any kind. But I got good enough at it. I'm a good enough teacher. I'm a good teacher. I can take concepts and kind of wrap them up and hand them to people in ways they can understand and go use them. I'm good at that. Right. I'm not the best at a lot of things, but I'm a good teacher. And so I started teaching these guys to date, and they started having good success as well. And so I was at a point, probably in my early 50s, where I would joke and say, I'm a marriage therapist that's been divorced twice and a dating guru that doesn't have a girlfriend. And yet people keep paying me money for, my wisdom. And, here is my selling point. Like I said, I think I'm a good teacher.
Yeah.
Both in how I write and how I speak. I'm a good communicator and people learn quickly from me. But I primarily teach the things I've struggled with. I've often said that my book, No More Mr. Nice Guy, is not a chronicle of my successes. It's a record of all my failures and fuck-ups. And it really is.
I love that.
Almost anything you read in that book, I've fucked that up at least once or twice. And that's why I said, hey, this doesn't work. And so I think that's where people really do like my teaching style. I'm very open. Guys will say, Robert, you're so authentic. I would not have been accused of being authentic 25 years ago. And I'm authentic because I really believe what I've learned, and especially what I've learned the hard way, and what I'm still struggling to get right, is probably the richest material that I can teach people and where people benefit the most. So again, maybe going back to the Tiger Woods, maybe you don't have to go get the guy that's won the Masters, but maybe you need to find the guy who understands, he's a systems analyst and he understands where systems break down, and he's good at communicating and helping people see where their system has broken and what they need to do to get it moving back the way they really want it to. So there's all kinds there's all kinds of mentors and coaches and leaders that we could go learn from. And, and a lot of people do. A lot of people kind of spread that around. They go get some wisdom here. They get some wisdom here.
Yeah.
I've had different therapists over the years. I've been in different men's groups, different men's programs, and I've learned from all of them. They've all been beneficial. And I think some people can get caught up in that's all they do is bounce from program to program. Yeah, and I think there can be a benefit of going really deep into one and letting somebody who's kind of made enough fuck ups along the way and learn from them enough to help guide you through that. So again, I don't know that I have a bright light for the gray area.
Okay.
But look for somebody kind of, here's the way I put it. I wrote a blog article a few years ago entitled something along the line, Why Math Majors Make the Worst Math Teachers. And that is because, and this was my experience, I did shitty in math as a kid. Because what happens is math comes easy to them. Otherwise, they wouldn't be math majors. They'd be poets or, historians or whatever. But they were good at math, so they kept taking more and more math classes. Mm-hmm. And because it came easy. So, they go get, their degrees in math, and then maybe they become a teacher. That's kind of a dumb way to use your math skills. It doesn't pay very well. But then, so they're going to teach, assuming all their students in their classroom grasp math concepts like they did. Mm. And so they're often really shitty teachers because they don't know how to teach the kids that are struggling with math concepts because they never struggled with it.
That makes so much sense. Yeah.
So I think there is a real value in finding people who've struggled with what you've struggled with, and maybe, through that, walk of fire have come up with some insights that at least maybe you don't repeat quite so many of the same mistakes they had to make.
I think that's golden to find somebody who's struggled with what you've struggled with.
Yeah.
That's a different kind of search than to find like you could, on one hand, we can say, go find somebody who's great at what you are working on. But it's the flip side of that coin is go find somebody who's struggled with the thing that you're working on. And they'll probably still be really great at it, but that's a completely different way of thinking about it.
I think it's a good tool because even as we're talking, I think about my coach, John, that I mentioned. He shared enough of his personal experiences that he struggled with a lot of the same things I have. I see a lot of myself in him, and I think he learns from me, and I learn from him. We've come at our struggles, from some different directions, but ended up a lot in the same place. And so, I think it's a great idea. Is find somebody who has struggled with what you've struggled with.
I like that. Getting back to your earlier description of rites of passage in tribal communities, oftentimes these rites of passage included the real risk of death. Here's your kid. Here's your spear. Go find a beast and bring it back dead, or don't come back. Kind of thing.
Yeah.
So in modern times, us guys, we still have that need in us to have those breakthroughs. But how important is actual physical risk in our rites of passage in 2019?
That's a good question, man. And I don't know that I've dug into that deeply, but I think what we need to feel is at least some degree of fear. And I'll give you an example. I'm not a big fan of pickup but yet I think pickup is one of those tribes that a lot of young men are drawn into as they're trying to figure out how to relate to women.
Right.
And there is some, I think some good aspects of pickup, even though overall I'm not a big fan, mainly because of the targeting of women and attachment to outcome.
Oh, that was absolutely one of my rites of passage. I discovered Eben Pagan's, Eben Pagan.
Yeah,
I found David D'Angelo.
David D'Angelo's stuff was the first stuff I got turned on to when I became in my 40s. And, I've been to some programs with Eben, and so that. And I don't even know. I wouldn't paint him as hardcore pickup.
Oh no, he's just a curator and an interviewer. That's what he's a marketer. He's genius at that.
He's an online marketer.
But from here, we discover Neil Strauss. We read The Game. We then discover and then it goes a million different directions. Fortunately, I discovered guys like Jordan Harbinger, The Art of Charm. Some of those guys that teach a more ethical, like personal development focused thing. But then you have the whole mystery route and the guys that are just really teaching tactics rather than personal development. Yeah,
and my term is I say those guys turn men into geeks with techniques.
Yeah,
they still can't look anybody in the eye and have a conversation, but they can run game.
Yeah,
they can do the poll questions and the negs, and they can peacock.
Oh yeah.
So here's the thing: there are some sound psychological principles that these guys teach to young men, and it challenges them to get out of their comfort zone. So, for example, I remember reading one example where a guy went to a dating or pickup boot camp, and his assignment was he had to put on a tutu and duct tape a dildo to the top of his head.
I remember this.
And like walk through a mall. Okay. Now that is actually really sound cognitive behavioral therapy flooding technique. Is that a true physical fear? Well, he might get beat up, so there might be some true life and death. But you know what? That's just pure out and out, just ego shattering, feeling shame. That's our ego doesn't necessarily have to be in a life and death physical situation. And so, like I said, that's just pure CBT. David Burns is kind of the godfather of cognitive behavioral therapy. He'll go out with his clients. He may be dead by now, but he was pretty old back when I used to listen to his stuff. He'd go out in New York City and lie on the sidewalk with his clients who were afraid of looking foolish and say, we're going to lie on our backs together and act like dead cockroaches waving our legs, or we're going to get on a city bus and sing the national anthem. Whatever it took to feel that fear, get flooded with your anxiety, and then come through it on the other side and go, that didn't kill me.
Right.
So does it have to be you actually go out and, face death by killing, a wild animal with your bare hands, or, jumping out of a tree with a vine tied around your ankle, or having, nails put through your chest and, you hang from your chest on a pole in the desert. I think it can be acting like a cockroach on a New York City street with your therapist. I think it can be, walking through a mall with a dildo duct taped to your head.
I love that visual. It never gets old. Yeah.
But the core is you face something that scares you shitless and you go do it. And yes, it often helps if you're not having to do it by yourself. Either you got a wingman with you, your therapist, your coach with you, or the whole tribe is having to do the exact same thing you're doing. And when you're looking around and go, they're doing it, I got no excuse. I better man up and do it as well.
So being scared shitless.
Yeah, and it doesn't matter what scares us shitless. I'm scared shitless of an angry woman. So, if I just stand up to an angry woman, I'm going through my initiation right there.
Right. I love that. Do you think it's, I've wondered before about lots of little rites of passage versus one really big defining moment, any thoughts there?
I think probably realistically, most of them are going to be lots of little rites of passages, every little fear. I don't know that most of us can really set up that one big defining moment. It might really either kill us or we, come through it. But I think lots of little rites of passages is what life is about. I'll give you an example. It may not sound like a big deal, but when I was pushing 40, man, it seems like a long time ago.
Like 2 weeks ago or so.
Yeah, 2 weeks ago. No, that's 23 years ago. Yeah. When I was pushing 40, I thought, all right, how do I want the second half of my life to be different? I was really contemplating that, during my 39th year. And it hit me just finally out of the blues that I don't want to die afraid. And it's not that I had a fear of dying. I didn't want to live the second half of my life being afraid of everything. Mm-hmm. So I made a commitment that if I had a fear, I was going to lean into it. And lo and behold, as soon as I made that commitment, all kinds of shit started raining down on me that I had to step up and deal with. And my then wife said, why did you make that commitment to face all of your fears? She said, as soon as you made that commitment, so many things have started going south that you've had to step up and deal with. But I even remember it could be as little as when I made that decision, I'd gone with my then second wife to Reno. And I'm not a big gambler. I'm not a big risk taker in general. I don't ride fast motorcycles. I don't rock climb. I don't jump out of airplanes. And I don't like gambling away my money. Sure. But I do like playing blackjack. And so I occasionally will go Vegas or Reno once every 3 years and, do something and play. Yeah. So anyway, I was in Reno and I'd given myself $100 a day allowance to play blackjack. And I'd go play the cheapest tables. And I thought, all right, I've decided to face all my fears. Well, what's my biggest fear? I thought, I'm going to go put $100 down on one hand of blackjack. And, that's a big deal for me. Back then, $100 didn't come real easily. So I did. I was afraid, went, I put the $100 down on the table, got my hand, and it had a really good hand, and it pushed the dealer. I thought, fuck, I can't walk away. Nothing's changed. So I left the $100 on the table. I lost the next hand. So I lost my $100 and I did a little happy dance as I walked away from the table. I'd lost my gambling money for the day, but I thought, but that felt damn good to just step up, do something out of my comfort zone, get at my edge, stretch myself and face my fear. And that little victory, that little rite of initiation was powerful. I still remember it. And it still made a difference in my life.
I love that. What would you say has been your biggest rite of passage in your life?
I would say it's been a relationship.
Yeah.
And I would say maybe that's true for most men. In fact, even the book that I'm currently writing, I'm writing it with one of the themes is that learning how to consciously show up in relationship with women is a very powerful personal growth machine and act of masculine initiation. Because for most of us men, we're scared shitless of women. Right. Like we go do pickup because we're afraid of women.
Yeah.
We beat them because we're afraid of them. We do, we give into them because we're afraid of them.
Misogyny
Whatever it is
comes from that.
Yeah, it comes from a fear of women. I live in a third world country. I live in Mexico where we've got a macho culture. And all these macho men are scared shitless of women. They're all little mama's boys. So it's a fear of women. So I think if we can have some sort of conscious leadership, and that's really what I'm trying to, try to weave into the book I'm writing now, that teaches us how to show up and treat this dynamic of masculine, feminine interplay in a laboratory that doesn't actually accommodate masculine, feminine very well, i.e., long-term monogamous relationship. Yeah. It's not in our DNA. We're not wired for it. So we're trying to do something really unnatural. So if we can actually consciously learn how to maximize a situation that doesn't come naturally or easily, I think that's a very powerful initiation.
I love that.
Especially if men can get past this fear, this fear of the feminine, the fear of what the feminine can do. Because for us men, the feminine is so unpredictable. It's so crazy. Yeah. It's so wild. It's so energetic.
And
it's
desirable.
So catch you by surprise. And we can't quit desiring it. We want to dive into it, and it scares the shit out of us. So that's where I think is really a very powerful initiation if we've got some tools for doing it. But if the only tools we've got is what mom and our preschool teachers gave us,
Oh,
or
forget it.
what pickup gave us,
Yeah.
or what the manosphere gave us. I don't know that we're going to do that very dynamically or very victoriously. And my spin on it is that if we men can learn to show up in that very conscious, powerful, dynamic way in our relationships with women, it's an amazing gift to women. And I think they're going to experience something that they've never had the opportunity to experience. And that's why I say, I think we're in exciting times. I think we're in a time where masculine consciousness is really shifting in very powerful ways. And I think that's going to be a beautiful gift to women and the feminine.
You know, in I think it's in The Game by Neil Strauss.
Yeah.
I can't remember if he says it in The Game or if he says it in one of his follow-up books, but I remember him specifically saying that women want us to succeed at this. They want us to show up and know how to handle the situation. They want us to be confident. They want us to know what to say. They want us to know how to put them at ease. They want us to have integrity. They want us to be good with women, you know, and it's been funny to see how see people's reactions to that. I've had so many women friends start reading that book, and at first they're kind of repulsed. And then they realize like, oh, that's actually a very good point. And I've wondered about, you know, your work is just a result of, and everything we've been talking about, how ubiquitous masculine failure is in our culture these days, because dad is so absent. We haven't had these small rites of passage as boys along the way. And so we have this massive generation of men that want the feminine in their life, but don't know where to go. And I've wondered if, for lack of a better term, pickup is like the quintessential 21st century rite of passage, you know, if there's
I believe it's a piece of it.
Opportunity there for guys to, it's an on-ramp into other things, you know.
It is. And I talk with a lot of guys who've had a background in pickup, and even most pickup artists outgrow it.
Pickup. I used to say it with big finger air quotes. You know,
is that you get past this little trick and this little game works on drunk 22-year-old girls with low self-esteem.
Yeah.
And when you actually get to where you see how just facing your fears, being yourself, being bold, that is a turn on to women and attracts them.
Yeah, and pickup is like the training wheels, you know.
It's the training wheels, and hopefully you kick them off at some point.
Yeah.
I personally believe that this kind of worldwide, I call it a tribal uprising, is I think pickup is a part of it, especially for younger generations of men. I think 12 steps can be a part of it. Mankind Project's part of it. Men looking for entrepreneurial groups is part of it. Men going through divorce, looking for divorce support groups. I think there's lots of different ways that this tribal uprising is being manifested. And again, I think not only will we men benefit by having that deeper connection with men, with our tribal brothers, with mentors, with coaches, with elders, with wise men, I think we'll benefit. We'll live life more masterfully. But as you and I have been talking, the women of the world benefit in that they get to hang out with conscious, masterful men with passion and direction and wide open hearts.
Yeah.
So, I'm not saying that every one of these, is teaching the same thing, but I think they're all serving part of the bigger purpose of initiating men into a more conscious way of walking the planet.
I love that. I like your optimism.
What's our alternative? I think, I am optimistic. I really am, because I see it. I live it. I'm around it. I make my living at it. I'm surrounded by men that are doing their work.
That's so cool.
And, I am optimistic. I understand, and probably pretty much all men probably understand, the attitude of like the men going their own way movement, of men just saying, we don't need women. We don't need blank, fill in the blank.
Sure.
We don't need these things. We'll go our own way. I get the appeal of that. Man, there are a lot of times I'd much rather just hang out with my buddies than deal with the craziness of the woman in my life. I can understand the bitterness of the incels, the involuntary celibates that they don't, they've never been laid, and they think there must be something terribly wrong with them, and nobody wants to feel like there's terribly something wrong with them. So it's easier to blame somebody or something else. Well, it's those women's fault because they're all hypergamous. They don't want guys like me. Blah blah blah. I can understand those feelings of helplessness and bitterness and resentment.
Sure.
And maybe even just kind of giving in, what the fuck, I'll sit and smoke dope, eat Cheetos, and play video games all day.
Right.
I mean, it makes sense, but I'm optimistic because at some point, a lot of these people hit bottom and are fortunate enough to find something that gives them another direction and hope and structure and discipline and accountability. And I just love, the internet has introduced, a boatload of shit into our world,
sure.
But it's also made accessible a lot of really good stuff. And I think the people that are putting good stuff out there, are doing it well, and it's easy to find. I like that.
I'm envisioning this like incel outreach program right now.
Hey, get laid. I gotta tell you a joke.
Yeah.
This really isn't a joke, but this shows my mother's sense of humor. My mother's 83. Actually, she's turned 84 a couple weeks ago. And she's very direct. I inherited a lot and learned a lot from my mom. She was the masculine in our family growing up. My dad was the moody one. But anyway, when I was in private practice, it's been about 8 to 10 years ago now, I was in Bellevue, Washington, which is east side of Seattle. Mm-hmm. And so Microsoft had like 40,000 employees there, and Amazon was really starting to build a presence there at that time. It already was. A lot of other tech-oriented companies there, kind of like Silicon Valley, but just in the Seattle area. And a lot of my clients were, kind of geeky men with no social skills with good health insurance. And and I remember talking with my mother one time about the autistic spectrum and Asperger's syndrome. And I was saying that my personal theory, based on some neurological evidence, is that probably Asperger's is probably an inherited trait from one or more Aspergery type parents. So, like Bill Gates and Melinda are probably, going to pump out some kids that, kind of have some Aspergery type traits. But everybody's so surprised. We want to blame, this autism on things we read on the internet, on vaccinations and this and that. And, it's funny. What I was joking with my mom about is these really obsessive, screaming kind of, my kid's autistic. It must be vaccination. It must, and they're just like, and you go, can they not look in the mirror and see that, that they probably fall on the spectrum somewhere themselves? And so my mother's response was, and you're teaching these men how to date and get laid? Aren't you contributing to the problem?
Touche, Mom.
so yes, well, we're gonna have an outreach to the incels to help them get laid so they can start fucking feeling better about themselves.
Right.
But we may be contributing to a bigger problem in the process.
I love it. Oh, you know what, Dr. Glover? This has opened up another can of worms. And one thing I'd like to talk to you about sometime is, because I've had this question: what about the women? Do women need rites of passage? We've been at this already for an hour, so I want to let you get on with your day. But just something to think about, the female side of this whole conversation, which is a whole other thing. But anyway.
Quick answer, yes, and it looks very different than the masculine initiation.
Can we talk about that sometime?
Hey, just send me an email.
Okay.
We'll do it again.
Fascinating. All right, I can't wait. We'll talk about the ladies and involve some of them in this somehow. So anyway, Dr. Glover, thank you so much for your time. This has been delightful as usual.
Paul, it was a blast. Thanks for the invitation.
Awesome. Have a great night.
You too.